Well, thank you very much, Chai, for joining us here tonight and for your willingness to talk about wars and how wars end. And Professor Dominic Lieven doesn't need any introduction. He's written many books on European history of wars and empires and emperors, and particularly also including the Russian world and everything around it. So thank you so very much, and let's start.
Okay, Gerhard, thank you very much. I was always told you never started a talk by making excuses or apologies, but I will say two things to start. Firstly, of course, this. I've written out notes, but I can't see them, I can't read them, so you'll have to forgive me if I wander about a bit without my rudder or radar or whatever you want to call it. The second and more important point is that what I'm talking about is, to a great extent, the war in Ukraine, but also the broader geopolitical context. On many of the issues I'm going to talk, I'm really no more expert half the time than you are. And I don't think anyone can be an expert on all the issues involved. This present war, of course, is to a significant extent going to be decided on the battlefield. Well, as you may have noticed, I'm not a general, but even listening to those who are generals and understand war, this is a complicated war because of the way in which technology is changing at such astonishing speed. That means drones above all, but by no means entirely. We are at the moment, I suppose, in terms of the First World War in 1916. In other words, in a state of attrition where you've got two sides trying to outlast each other. So to understand what might happen, you have to understand the economics, the economies, the finance, the political economy, the leadership of Russia and Ukraine. I wouldn't call myself an expert on either. Beyond that, both the Ukrainians and to a somewhat lesser extent the Russians are dependent on external allies and help. So the politics of Europe, to some extent the politics of the United States, the politics of China are also absolutely crucial to what is going to happen. So, as I say, what I will be talking about is the war, but also the broader geopolitical context. And if it looks as if I'm going to wander for more than 30 minutes, just tell me to shut up, Gerhard, and we'll have a
and
discussion.
also, what I think there's a particular interest with your white, historian.
Well, that's all right.
About how wars end.
I'll get there.
Some people
I'll get there. I'll get there. I'll
okay.
get there. What I will spend most of my time talking about is Ukraine and the broader geopolitical context. But where I will start is precisely the title, which Gerhard asked me to address a comment by J.D. Vance, who said that all wars tend to end in negotiations. So that is where I start now. I mean, it's about 75% nonsense. All wars do not end in negotiations. If we go up to the high geopolitical end, the world we live in is essentially the world which was created in the 18th century. Western predominance, and within the West, Anglo predominance. And in sort of military geopolitical terms, that goes back to the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763. It was that war which determined that North America would be Anglo and the Indian empire of the Mughals would be inherited by the British, not the French. That I think of as the sort of, in a way, the geopolitical foundation for the order in which we live, which is ebbing away in front of our eyes right now. In other words, Western predominance and Anglo within it. You could see the revolutionary and Napoleonic wars, the two world wars and the Cold War as attempts to assault that predominance of the Anglosphere, all of which were defeated. There was not a compromise, they were defeated. That's the world we live in now. British power initially is partly geopolitical. Britain has the enormous advantage of being an island off the northwest coast of the dominant region of the world, with very well placed to control Europe's connections to the outside world, very well placed to manage the European continental balance of power to its own favour. But it's also rooted in British financial, naval, commercial, to some extent manufacturing power. the fact that 2 generations later Britain becomes the first land of the Industrial Revolution hugely strengthens its position. That position is then to some extent challenged and vulnerable once, as was almost inevitable, the Industrial Revolution spreads to continental Europe. By the 1870s and 80s, Germany is emerging as a challenger. By the 1900s, up to 1914, the Industrial Revolution is spreading into the Russian Empire, and the First World War starts above all else because the Germans think they'll win it today, but that Russia will be overwhelmingly powerful within a generation. And they start the First World War to avert that likelihood. It's not the only reason, but I think it's the biggest single reason. Even at that time, though, 1914, the Industrial Revolution has spread to Island Asia, which means Japan. And there were a number of Russian intellectuals perfectly intelligent enough to predict that just as the Industrial Revolution had spread from island Europe into continental Europe, Germany, it would do the same as regards China, and that China would become Russia's main adversary in Eurasia. Very interesting little article written by an extremely unpleasant but highly intelligent right-wing intellectual in Russia called Mikhail Menshikov in 1908, telling the Russians to calm down because it would take the Chinese 3 generations, and by then the British would have been kicked out of India and would be Russia's natural ally against Chinese dominance in Asia, Eurasia. The details are different, but you can see the logic. The Russians, having just lost a war against Japan, were very sensitive to the realities of the rise of Asian power. They were less sensitive to the realities of American power, though not entirely so. When I was teaching in Harvard in '93, there's a lovely man called Akira Irie, who probably none of you have heard of, but was the most distinguished and also one of the nicest professors of East Asian history I knew. And he committed his life, really, to the hope of bringing China peacefully into the Western liberal democratic, liberal capitalist international order. I remember a rather depressed dinner with him. Not depressed, it was a lovely dinner, but I depressed him because I said to him that it seemed to me that bringing in China was going to be a great deal more difficult than bringing in the Kaiser's Germany. And since we'd failed to do that, our chances with China were not great. And the reason I said was partly sheer geopolitics and power. Germany was the predominant power in a multipolar European system. China was the great power of East Asia, an imperial power, empire-dominated East Asia. So in terms of pure power, it would be more difficult to bring in to an Anglo-dominated system than Germany. And it was also, in cultural, historical, political, every other terms, much more alien than Germany, which was, after all, basically a European, capitalist, semi-liberal, Protestant-dominated country. So that's at the top end of geopolitics, and it helps to explain much of the context of where we are. It seems to me that the challenge facing Western predominance and Anglo predominance now is significantly more severe than it was in 1914 or 1939. That is because, and there are endless other things to say, crudely put, if you combine the resources of the British Empire and the United States, they are overwhelming. The margin of superiority was enormous, which I suspect is one reason why they could afford both to have democracy and geopolitical victory. The margin is now much less if you look at the world as a whole. It is true that if you add the United States and its allies just against China, there is still a significant predominance. But the alliance is in deep trouble, and one wouldn't want to push it. So that, I think, is the geopolitical essence. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that the present world order is not based on negotiation at the end of war. It is based on all-out war and final victory. The other aspect of the war in Ukraine is that it is a war of imperial succession, if you like, and to some extent, you wouldn't want to exaggerate it, but to some extent a civil war. There was great division in Ukraine. There would not have been a revolt in eastern Ukraine without the Russians, but they did have some material to work with. It is also true that they have exploited Donetsk and the Russians, well, particularly Donetsk, to an enormous degree. The level of conscription and the mortality rates in the east are much higher than in Russia's own regions. So, all right, we look at wars of post-empire. I'm not going to go off on a great spiel, I've done this to you once before, but much of the world's worst conflicts are the product of the collapse of the British Empire and its consequences, and they are still going on, sometimes almost a century later. There have been ceasefires in Kashmir, there have been ceasefires in even 1 or 2 peace treaties in Palestine, etc. But the wars rumble on. There is a real risk that you could, it's a very, very strong possibility that the war in Ukraine won't end. It may freeze, but it will unfreeze periodically into further conflict. So that is one big possibility. Of course, it is also true that some post-imperial wars do end neither in negotiation nor in frozen conflicts. They end in the outright victory of one side or the other. That would be obviously true as regards the FLN struggle in Algeria, which resulted in the ethnic cleansing and removal of the whole French colon population. The most spectacular example are the wars of the Germans, or the Germanic post-imperial space, which are otherwise politely known as the Second World War. And you might say that we did come to a solution. There was outright victory at the cost of World War, scores of millions of dead, the extermination of one of the true great diaspora peoples of the Austrian Empire, in other words, the Germans. Of the Jews, and the total ethnic cleansing of the other, the Germans. I mean, to be a bit less apocalyptic and closer to present, within the post-Soviet space, there have been a number of conflicts. I meant to look this up, but my eyes undid me. I think if you looked at the relative populations of Azerbaijan and Armenia and compared their casualties per head to the casualties of Russia and Ukraine per head, you'd probably find the Armenians and the Azeris are on the same level, if not higher. And that war has ended in the outright victory of the Azeris after 30 years of conflict which froze, unfroze, etc. The Armenians have been driven out of the whole of Nagorno-Karabakh, total ethnic cleansing, total Azeri victory. The reasons for this was not how the war went for the first 20 or the conflict went for the first 25 years, or 20 years, no, 25 years. The Azeris were more energetic, more patriotic, more skillful, full of initiative, all the things we say about Ukraine. But they had less, their only real international support was the Russians, who, in a sense, went home once they were dragged away into the war with Ukraine, or dragged themselves away, for God's sake. At which point the Azeris were able to overwhelm the Armenians, above all else because Azeri wealth, oil wealth, meant that they could buy in modern military technology. And with their modern military technology, all the skill and the patriotism and the commitment of the Armenians was not enough. None of this says how the war in Ukraine will end. All of it does ask questions. It's in the nature of things. I'm not an expert on this contemporary war or its origins. I am something of an expert on some of the broader context. It makes sense to talk about that. All right, on to the war itself. I mean, it is 1916 in Europe in one sense. We are now in the midst of, to some extent, a stalemate, a war of attrition, which, like most wars of attrition, will test not just the armies, but the strength of the economic and political systems and the commitment of the peoples to the war effort. If you'd asked me in 2023, I would have said this is really very, very, very like the First World War on the Western Front, the failure of the Ukrainian counter-offensive against, Russian fortifications, trenches, etc. That war has to some extent evolved into something else. It is still true that, as in 2022 and as in the First World War, current military technology very much enhances the power of the defensive. And at its most basic, the problem in 2025 is the same as it was in 2023 and 2024. It is extremely difficult to concentrate the mobile military power, which above all means armour, mobile infantry, etc., in the face of drones, artillery and missiles. That remains true. On the other hand, the front now is not what it was in 2023. It's not any kind of continual defence line, particularly in the areas of greatest fighting. The zone of conflict is often 10, 15 miles wide, and virtually nothing can move on it for much of the time because of drones. The lines are rather lightly defended, and as I say, though infiltration tactics are possible, consolidating victory on operational, let alone strategic, breakthroughs are extremely difficult. That doesn't mean that will always remain the case. It is to the point that armies looking at this war, which have got the money, are still building up, investing a great deal in armour. That isn't just military atavism, it is a belief that the technology, as has happened before, can be tweaked so that the offensive will regain some of its power. So we've got to see. If you look at the strengths and the weaknesses of the two sides, look, on the Ukrainian side, they have, if you want to put it that way, the advantage of fighting on their own soil for their own country against an adversary which claims that they have no right to exist. That is a powerful incentive. They've seen what the Russians have done, and Ukrainian patriotism and endurance is remarkable. So also is Ukrainian skill. There has been an enormously impressive mobilization of initiative, certainly in the drone war. Some of the Ukrainian operations far behind the Russian lines have been spectacular. At the same time, it's not all a question of strength, there are also weaknesses. It is certainly, to a historian, very remarkable that the Ukrainians have not been able to conscript the younger classes of Ukrainian males, let alone conscript Ukrainian young females to fight at the front. And when Zelensky, for various reasons, opened the borders so that males aged 18 to 25 could, or 22 I think it is, could go abroad, very large numbers have done so this year. And there is an acute manpower shortage at the front, and that is a problem. It's also wrong to think that the Russians have learnt nothing or are entirely incompetent. At a technical level, the Russians have adapted quickly to drone warfare. The biggest, I think, innovation this year, these sort of nasty, horrible drones with fibre optic cables, are a Russian invention, and basically have nullified the whole of the traditional, 5-year-old way of jamming, electronically moved drones. The Russians apparently also have tweaked their missiles so that the American Patriot anti-missile systems are only half effective. And there have been some improvements at the tactical level. Where the Russians are still certainly weaker than the Ukrainians, and sometimes much weaker, is at the coordination of armour, artillery, small unit infantry, all this kind of stuff, both at the lieutenant, captain, major and even colonel level. There is still a lack of initiative. Changing a military culture is far harder than changing technology, and is not made any easier by the fact that most of the professional army is dead by now, because it died in the first year or two of the war. So they've got a militia, and they are often using the most vicious tactics. What happens next? Who knows? I mean, it is very, very much in the balance. I mean, if you look at it from Putin's perspective, and that is a very important perspective, he still, I think, believes he's going to win. Of course, he's going to say that, but I think he probably still does, and certainly so do many of the hardliners, who, you have to remember, are the bit of Russian society he fears most within the system. They blame him for not having got all the way to Odessa in 2014, when the Russian army certainly will have got there. They blame him for having messed up the initial invasion in 22, and again, they're dead right. And their argument is that if we really pull our fingers out and commit ourselves fully to this war, we'll win. Now, it is to the point that they have just changed the law so that they can mobilise reservists. They claim they're not going to send them to the front, but they're just going to guard things in the rear. We'll see. I mean, at the moment, Russian tactics are devastatingly crude, and the Russians are said, and I think this is probably true, to lose 5 dead for every 1 Ukrainian. If you conscript Moscow and St. Petersburg and send its sons to die on that level, commanded by brutish Second World War punitive column tactics, then the regime might be in trouble. And that is a constraint on Putin. As for the economic pressures, I'm not the right person to say, and the new economic pressures coming in now, it's too early to say what will happen. The sanctions have had an effect. They certainly have had an effect. But if you remember what Putin said about North Korea, if you're prepared to eat grass, economic pressures only work up to a certain point. We'll have to see. It's not negligible. I doubt whether in itself it will be enough to force him to compromise. And, the Russians are correct to say that if European support fades, Ukraine loses the war. The basis of this war is Putin's, in his mind, is his argument that Ukraine and Russia is one place, one people, and that Ukrainians who don't accept that are traitors, not just enemies, but traitors. They've been stirred up by foreign, manipulation, firstly by the Poles, then by the Austro-Hungarians, and now by the wicked West. His argument that the Russians and Ukrainians are one people is about 90% nonsense. If you really go back 1,000 years, it is true that the earliest origins of the Russian monarchy and of the Russian Orthodox Church lie on what is now Ukrainian soil. It is probably true 1,000 years ago that the ancestors of the Ukrainians, East Slav and Orthodox, are more like the Russians than the Britons, Anglo-Saxons and Scandinavians who inhabited England 1,000 years ago. That is of zilch contemporary relevance, except for the fact it feeds into a Russian, first Tsarist and now Russian nationalist narrative. The basic point is that England is a small country long since integrated economically, and it was also, there may have been Romano-Britons, Anglo-Saxons and Scandinavians 1,000 years ago, but they've lived under a single crown for 1,000 years. No Ukrainian, in inverted commas, lived under Moscow's rule until the mid-17th century, and even then it was very light touch for generations. A solid quarter of the Ukrainian population never lived under Russian rule until the Second World War and subsequently. But of course there's a catch to that. The reality of this war, and probably the deepest reality, is that Putin has given Ukraine what in a sense it never had and deeply needed: a unifying resistance myth, heroic resistance struggle against an enemy, Russia. And the fact that the biggest victims of Putin's war have been the Russian-speaking, traditionally pro-Russian communities of the south and east makes that even more true. But just because the Russians and Putin know that any Ukrainian state is going to be bitterly anti-Russian, that is in a sense an extra incentive to destroy it. You want to get all the way to Odessa, so you cut them off from the Black Sea. You then destroy as much as you can in the rest of Ukraine, drive as much of the population into Europe, where they will exacerbate the anti-immigration movement and make it very difficult for Ukraine to recover. There is a ghastly logic in what these are people saying, and I'm moving off towards the end now. They are right to think that if European support fades, then Ukraine will go under. They can't survive. It's partly straight military support, it's partly financial support. Will European aid at its present level fade? I think probably not. At one level, in geopolitical terms, the European Union and Europe as a whole is facing the challenge for which the European Union was created. At some time, the Americans were going to go home. There was no way they were going to go on paying, fairy godmother or fairy godfather to a Europe which had the resources of, after its post-war recovery. This is the moment. Of course, the sad thing is the French, who were always the great prophets of this, are now not in a position to really play a very active role, given their domestic political crisis and their budgetary and other problems. And that is a sort of parable for the whole issue. In principle, Europe has the resources to deter Russia. It needs modest and relatively temporary American support, but it can basically do the job if it's given 5 years to gear up. The key is always, as always, Germany, both because of its geopolitical position in Central Europe and because of its, the fact that it is primus inter pares and must be in Europe in terms of power. And probably the Germans will be able to sustain the war. And the East Europeans and the Scandinavians will certainly be committed. It's obviously rather harder to persuade the Spanish that, the threat of Putin arriving in Madrid, which is rather small, is greater than the various other threats facing Spanish people, all the immediate ones that we know in Europe, and indeed in the West as a whole, plus the fact that Europe, like America, to an extent is involved in a war on two fronts, the obvious one, the geopolitical one against Russia and in the United States case potentially China, but also the bigger one against all the problems coming from the global south, which in Europe means Africa. And if you combine demography, climate change and a whole number of other things, you're going to find it very hard to persuade any government in Madrid or even in the long run in Rome that the challenge from the east is much more significant than the challenge from the south. Europe needs a more integrated, in other words, security policy, which is very much geared to building up its military and geopolitical strength, but also does take into account factors like climate change and migration. The Americans, it seems to me, that even if the Democrats had got back, they were not going to go on splurging money on Ukraine in the way that had been happening. I think, trying to predict what Trump is going to do is, a fool's game. But I can't see any obvious reason why Trump will pull the plug from sharing, which is crucial, American intelligence with Ukraine, which costs him nothing, and allowing Europeans to help the American defense industry by buying American weapons. One doesn't know, and he might go off the tangent, but it seemed to me that he's got no reason to do that. And for all their utter spinelessness, I think there are significant Republicans in the Senate who would make his life difficult if he tried to do it in anything but a short-term tantrum. The issue then, of course, becomes, will the Americans be distracted? As some of the leadership, is already saying loudly, so distracted by events in East Asia that they need to shift their not, unlimited military resources and therefore economic and financial resources to the confrontation with China. The answer is we'll see. If the Americans and the Chinese together decided to end the war, they could. Russia is not as dependent on China as the Ukraine is on Europe or the West, but it is dependent. But the Chinese don't have any great incentive to do that, and for obvious reasons. It's interesting that nobody seems to have talked about the war in Ukraine when Xi met Putin. They didn't, of course, talk about Taiwan either, because that's not the way to get a temporary truce on the commercial front. I think so. There is a very real danger that what we're looking at in Ukraine is a bit like Japan's war in China in the 1930s. In other words, it is going to morph into a greater conflict called the Third World War. It seems to me that the Chinese regime and Xi Jinping is deeply serious about getting back Taiwan sooner rather than later, and that he will have the support of Chinese nationalists, and as long as the war isn't lost, Chinese public opinion when he does so. It also seems to me absolutely clear that he's going to have to use coercion at some point, since there is no way the Taiwanese are going to vote themselves back into China. The ideal solution would be autonomy, but Chinese sovereignty, and Chinese military bases, but complete internal self-government. That actually is extremely difficult to do, particularly for authoritarian regimes. It was Alexander's vision in 1814-15. Poland could not be allowed independence because it was the strategic gateway to Russia, but it had to be given a liberal constitution and maximum autonomy. As his advisors told him, it's very difficult to be autocratic Tsar of Russia and constitutional king of Poland, and it would be very difficult, as we saw in Hong Kong, harder even in Taiwan, to manage that compromise. So I think we're going to have a war. Whether it's going to be an all-out war or whether it's going to be limited coercion, blockades, this and that and everything else, I just don't know. Your guess is as good as mine. I suspect it's not going to come right now because the Chinese economy is not perfect, and therefore there is a lot to be said for trying to survive the present economic problems. But it's not so disastrous that Argentine-style the Chinese leadership needs to, indulge in some foreign adventure. Beyond that, certainly in terms of its nuclear weapons program, but also some of its conventional weapons, China is boosting its arms but hasn't finished its present program of modernization, and I think probably feels that in 3 or 4 years' time it will be militarily stronger than it is now. Above all, I suspect that since Trump is wrecking the Western alliance and threatening to get the Americans into all sorts of trouble, even in the Western Hemisphere, and since there is a possibility, not a probability, but a possibility of real deadlock around a future election in the United States, why give the Americans something they can rally around when they're sort of halfway towards a civil war? So let's wait and see. I mean, I just don't know. As to the consequences, I think a very interesting question is that if the Americans did decide to go to the defense of Taiwan, they could not do so without using their bases in Japan. That means that the Japanese civilian population will be the target, almost certainly, of Chinese rockets. And if we had, if the war comes quickly, which the American specialists argue among themselves ferociously, whether the Chinese will go for a slowly blockade strangulation strategy, or will they'll turn one of their exercises into an attempt at a coup de main. If it's a coup de main, it'll happen before any Japanese government, let alone Japanese public opinion, has a chance to do anything. If it's a long drawn-out campaign, even a matter of a few months, and the tensions really ratchet up, I wonder what Japanese public opinion is going to say, because I think the Japanese are very sympathetic for Taiwan, but they don't want to die for it, which they will do in large numbers if it becomes a third world war. So we have to see. But I think this is probably the most dangerous moment, except for the brief Cuba crisis, since the Second World War. And I think the chances that it will move in the direction of an outright military conflict between the Chinese and the Americans, well, are not, I think, well, look, I don't know. Depends whether I have a stomachache in the morning and whether someone's been polite to me or not. But it's certainly too dangerous for comfort. And if we did get to the stage of outright conflict, America is very sort of mixed this and that, but if thousands of Americans are killed, which they would be, certainly, if the United States got involved immediately in an attempt to block them, the Americans probably fail, but they would, if they tried to block a Chinese coup de main, that might fail for its other reasons. Within time, thousands of Americans would die, at which point American public opinion would go mad. And God only knows what would happen next. So, you see I needed my wine. I finished.
Thank you so much. I don't know if this is encouraging or depressing.
You'd have to have a very, I think, Dr. No attitude to think a third world war would be encouraging.
No.
Not unless you had very large investments in munitions and a safe home in Antarctica.
Well, on this note, I hope we have find some optimism somewhere tonight. Thank you so very much.
Not at all.